Hello, everybody. I'm Charles Landry, and I'm convening a conversation between four very interesting people. But it's all part of something called the Falling Walls Circle Table. And Falling Walls, as many of you will know, is an amazing project, event, and so on that discusses and explore how walls fall in science, humanities, and basically what are the issues at the edge? Where do we go next? And what we're going to discuss today is the topic, the delights and dilemmas of enabling digitally driven, citizen-centered solutions for cities. I know that's a mouthful, but you'll be able to cope, I'm absolutely sure. And I suppose the issues we're going to discuss are things like, why is this important? Does it help create self-sustaining cities? What do you have to do? And how do you do it? What methods do you use? So can I just briefly introduce the four people who are participating, and this will be the sequence in which I'll ask the first question. And I hope you all, between each other, if we just deal with this informally, you can ask people questions and so on. So the first person we have here is Gabriela Gomez Mont, and she's known for a number of reasons. She was Chief Creativity Officer, very nice title, by the way, Gabriela, of Mexico City. And she's best known, perhaps, for having run the Laboratorio para la Ciudad in the city. And now she runs an organization she's just set up called Experimentalista. Jutta Meyer, who I've only recently met, she does something completely different. Her son, at the age of 10, said, "Take me to Silicon Valley. I want to do coding." Anyway, that started a very long, intense relationship between Silicon Valley and Germany. And she's done lots of things to do with business and the link between business and the public sector, all these sorts of things. But of particular interest here is that she set up an NGO called Identity Valley. And that's really about issues like AI and trust AI and transparency AI and ethics. The third person we have here is Vanessa Avis, and you will see at the back of her picture, if you guess where she is, you get a prize. But anyway, she's in Singapore at the moment, and she runs an institute for science and technology. But the key word at the end of the name of her institute, I love it at least, is for humanity. And lastly, we have Frank Niederlander, who is the CEO of the BMW HQ Foundation, which is based in Berlin and Munich. And they have a couple of projects that are interesting. One, their main project is about responsible leadership. But here they have a project they set up recently called RISE. RISE stands for Resilience, Intelligence, Sustainability, and Equalities. So I suppose our conversation here is about the I bit, intelligence. What do we do with it? How can we gather it? And E, I suppose, the equalities thing. And when that all happens, we've got a sustainable, resilient city, I hope. Anyway, off we go. Can I ask you, Gabriela, the first question? Now, this may have a lot of digital stuff in it or not, but you'll explain. Two of the great projects you did in Mexico City when you were running the lab was, one, you crowdsourced a constitution for Mexico City, a city of 20 million people. And secondly, you also crowdsourced some amazing map, because there was some incoherence between the 30,000 public buses that were racing around the city and nobody probably knew how to get from A to B. Do you mind just talking a bit about that and linking it a bit to our topic.
Absolutely. So very briefly, perhaps as an interesting background for this conversation, is that the lab was created to make a bridge between civil society and government. So one of our premises was that there's huge untapped talent within Mexico City, as in any other city, and that perhaps we needed to actually migrate towards a paradigm where government, instead of being the big provider of services and that does something with the citizen complaints, is actually becomes a great orchestrator of this incredibly underutilized resource, which is citizen talent, as I mentioned. So many of our projects dealt with that. And perhaps one of the more interesting insights that we had is that in many ways, beyond specific projects, it's actually also really interesting to start making cities that are enabling environments in and of themselves, where you're thinking of notions such as open knowledge, non-proprietary platforms, open data, digital commons, urban commons, et cetera, et cetera. So you not only link up citizens and also use citizen smarts to actually make the city better and to bringing ideas from elsewhere, but you also create environments where this is possible. So besides passing, let's say, the open city law that mandated a lot of these things for the first time and creating the first open data portal and APIs for the Mexico City government, we also wanted to get our hands wet and dirty, if you will, ourselves, put our money where our mouth was, and we did 2 projects that were quite successful. It was an experiment, both of them. We didn't know if they were going to work, but the first one, to your point, Charles, crowdsourcing a Mexico City constitution was one of the most fascinating projects that I worked on. One of them is because the constitution that we have now, which is now like a legal document, is one of the most progressive constitutions in the world. And as you can also imagine, having a constitution for a city, which Mexico City fortunately functions as a city state, so we're not in any we don't have a governor, if you will, but the mayor of Mexico City is both mayor and governor in a sense, actually allowed us to update our sovereignty and our independence from federal law. And as we're all seeing right now, especially I think in certain countries, there can be quite a bit of tension between progressive cities pushing agendas that are just, socially just and socially progressive vis-a-vis the national laws. So what we wanted to do was to get other voices besides the voices that the mayor had already convened, because there was a group of 28 notables, that they were called, that were pulled from everything from academics, activists, people that had been in government, like the first mayor of Mexico City, people that dealt with everything from disability to gender rights, et cetera, et cetera. We wanted to create a layer that was much more citizen driven and bring in the voices of the everyday people. Because even though specialists were incredibly enamored with the idea of having a constitution, in a certain sense, it was very difficult to translate to a day-to-day on the street person, if you will, why this was important. So we actually managed to create a participatory scaffolding that I won't get into too much detail because it's a long story, but several ways of being able to add your ideas, some of them very time intensive, of working, forming working groups and working for quite a few months on specific projects and agendas for the Constitution. And others were more like urban imaginaries that were a quick survey and thermometer. So we actually managed to engage with just one of the exercises that we did in experiments, almost 500,000 people through a collaboration that we did with change.org. And another quite interesting way that we got to bring in that social thermometer was creating an urban imaginary survey of 31,000 people across 1,400 neighborhoods in the city. And now we have one of the, again, most progressive constitutions in the world, where everything from new generation transsexual rights to indigenous rights to gender to mobility as a right. So many things. I wouldn't even know where to start. All of the things that are now up on the constitutional level, which is an important thing. So I might leave it there and leave Mapaton for the next round, so I don't take up too much time.
No, that's great, Gabriela. Jutta, well, you can perhaps say something about what Gabriela's just said, but tell us also, obviously, about what this Identity Valley is and how it might relate to what Gabriela's just talked about.
Yes, thank you. So first of all, I'm super impressed what Gabriela told us recently. So yeah, congrats to all these projects. That's amazing work and super important, I think. So what I learned by flying back and forth to Silicon Valley over the last years, not just because of my son, also because of my own curiosity and because I wanted to yeah, bring all these innovations and technologies and also the Silicon Valley mindset kind of to Germany especially, and yeah, help people understand, executives understand what's going on there and how we can adapt this to our environments here. And so the creation of Identity Valley for me was a kind of logical step, because in Silicon Valley everything is based on a material, what made possible that we have these supercomputers in our hands and yeah, use technologies because they are there and because they are getting invented most of the time out of Silicon Valley. But I think that there might be a better way to focus on innovation now, because now after more than 10 years, like we are used to use all these technologies, even as citizens, maybe it's time to start something that is focused more on us and on people, on our identity. And as we learned 4 years ago, so we have a big dilemma in our world right now, because there was a president elected because they were able to manipulate voters. So the CEO of Cambridge Analytica, I don't know if you are aware of that, recently got charged for that. So he's not allowed to take any CEO position for 7 years now, because this was unethical use of technology. And I think this is something which needs much more awareness in our world. And so we are focused on securing our identity using technology by starting thinking differently about products and services in the digital way that help people understand their power with their data, and help them by being a participant in all these projects. So what Gabriela did, talking to the citizens and bringing them into the projects, is exactly what we think that is needed. First, you have to make them aware their data is the most powerful and valuable source for our digital solutions, especially in cities. And if we can find solutions where they find trust into these technologies, this might be helpful to create more powerful, trusted technical solutions yeah, for a better world.
Yeah, thank you. There are a couple of things. I mean, one of your slogans of Identity Valley, just for the others to know, is the digital revolution needs digital responsibilities. And so I think that's quite a good summary phrase there. And I think one of the themes already coming across now is this issue of trust and transparency. Can I just move to you, Vanessa? I mean, some of your main themes are things like human media interaction. How does the human being interact with new media, and how do people and machines connect? And you've got these phrases I picked up from you: social intelligence, social artificial intelligence, and social awareness. All of these sort of words. And what you've really talked about a lot, I think, is to avoid sort of blocking out the human being in all of these projects. Can you just explain a bit about where you're at and so on? That would be great.
Sure. Thanks for the introduction, Charles, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'm very honored to be part of this panel. So yeah, I'm an engineer by background, so I'm a converted person speaking here. I have a computer science background, and my research is mostly in social artificial intelligence and robotics. So I think I learned very early on that to make really good AI or to make a really good robot, what you don't need is a whole bunch of roboticists, right? I really needed to work together with ethicists, psychologists, anthropologists, and so I'm a huge proponent of interdisciplinary team research, team science, and that would include, I would say, citizens. So that's something that I would definitely want to put in front of Gabriela and Ute, to kind of go beyond crowdsourcing and think about the citizens as taking ownership over the scientific questions that they might have in their environment. You asked me about kind of social artificial intelligence, automatic human awareness. It's something that I've been looking at. So this is that technology understands that it is implemented in a social environment, that a computer or a robot or a machine in a hospital understands that the environment is essentially built around people, and people are socially programmed. So there are things you need to know. You need to be emotionally aware. In what kind of emotional state are these people? You might want to know in a hospital setting, for instance, if a person is experiencing pain. Social situations are important. If there's an emergency situation and people are scared or panicked, there's a different way to respond to them to make sure that they go to safety, or that they respond in the way that helps mostly, especially if there is an automatic or machine response. So it's really about understanding people, automatically interpreting their behavior. And there's of course a huge shadow side to that, because it means observing people. It means machine learning over their data, which really they own. And it's about interpreting people's emotions, interpreting people's social situations. It's a huge breach of privacy. So there's a very delicate balance that would have to be reached.
Yeah, so a couple of things coming up there, which is really related to the my data movement, but also what's interesting, Gabriella's outfit, the lab, had probably precisely the type of people you're talking about. She had artists in there, economists, political scientists, anthropologists, all sorts of various people in her team. So it's interesting that you have a similar version in your team. But just before I move over to Frank, there are two words I quite like that you just brought up there. One is emotions is one of the key things, but another word beginning with E I like, and I feel somehow in our discussion, which is empathy. Anyway, Frank, what do you think about all that, what you've heard there, and then just tell us a bit about what you hope to do with all of your projects?
Yeah, thank you, Charles, and also a great thank. I'm happy to be part of this setting and this panel. And unfortunately, we are working or cooperating with some of the panelists already here. And I think what has been given in this discussion is that what we have seen throughout the world. And the key idea, and then that's perhaps before coming to RISE, I'd like to give you some insight about the foundation and where we were coming from. At the foundation, we are a leadership organization or a network organization, and our frame is the 2030 agenda of the United Nations. And within that, the framework of the SDG 11, so sustainable cities and communities, have been a very important topic to us. What we have seen, however, is that we believe that the role of the citizen has to be more incorporated in those processes. And a lot of decisions have to be taken care of by the citizen. However, you need new alliances to deliver that. And especially coming from our approach with having a cross-sectoral perspective, you need to find new processes to get a different perspective into the decision process, but also to manage the implementation to that. As a foundation beyond the question of the SDG 11, we are working, as we say, with a mission of responsible leadership. And doing this means to bring people together which are in important roles in the organization, but who are also interested to work beyond their power in their role towards the 2030 agenda and towards a more sustainable, just, and more equal future. And in the past years, we had been active in different corners. For instance, in the context of cities, we had been working with an organization like Cities Can Be in Latin America, Makes Sense, coming from France, or the Red Dot Foundation, which had been implementing all bottom-up approaches. What we see, however, and now we are in 2020, we are just one decade away from the 2030 agenda timeline. And all of us working on such processes know that 1 decade, it's not very much. You know, the time to plan, but even more time to develop solutions and then to implement them. 2030 is in front of our door. And that's why we were saying that from now on, basing on our activities, which had been very fruitful up to now, we'd like to move much further towards a more solution-oriented approach and finding alliances with organizations which are more focused on this kind of topics. In our own context, for instance, we had created an accelerator program called Respond, which had been launched this year, which has the focus on fostering startups which from the beginning try to incorporate impact into their business model. That has been very successful. I had been amazed at the first cohort we have seen. We have just finished it like 2 weeks ago in our demo night. And you see that there will be a new generation of founders, for instance, which are really motivated to drive solutions, and by that inspiring also others. And now the next step, which is even more focused on cities, is the so-called RISE program. And RISE stands for Resilience, Intelligence, Sustainability, and Equitability. And that's for us a very important framework, which beyond going and beyond just talking about sustainability, setting the frame where we are looking for solutions and where we are looking for partnership to do this. From the foundation side, as I mentioned, being a global leadership organization, we have experience and resources to facilitate those kind of cooperation, and we see us more as moderating and bringing different processes together. And depending on our involvement, as I mentioned, to Respond, it can range from corporations up to really accelerator programs fostering ideas. We had said that over the next 2 years, our focus will be on the RISE cities. And as cities, again, is a huge topic, we were saying what could be our contribution. And then I will come to a point which at the first glance sounds very normal for foundation with our name, but historically had not been the focus. And I'm talking about mobility, but in a sense of how it's important for the development of humanity. And that's why I loved the relation to Vanessa's institute, because I think as the writing and later on information had been a very strong element to many developments and advancements in human development, we see the holistic approach of mobility in the same context. And I think Gabriela mentioned it even for Mexico earlier on, that mobility is a basic right. At the end, it's about success, whether it's for housing, for work, for culture, for different elements. And we'd like, in the context of citizen orientation, look how solutions of mobility can help to improve life, improve cities to come to a more RISE perspective in their future development. Having said that, and having based on our experience, I think in the first phase we were doing different discussions throughout Europe this year to get into contact with different cities. Of course, the current crisis and its limitations of traveling had led to this narrow focus. But at the next stage, and which stage which had been planned for this year also, but which has to be postponed to next year, are the so-called RISE City Labs. And these will be areas where we really try to co-create with others on new solution and solution which incorporate citizen and citizen decision-making process, bringing different perspective into it and bringing new elements and a new kind of dialogue to this. And of course, it had been mentioned before, I see a strong element on technology on that. It, in my perspective, should go beyond current settings, current round tables discussion, which are really important, but probably have not the scale and not the empowerment for citizens for the future challenges. So from this perspective, I love to come back, Charles, to the discussion here and perhaps to highlight the different options the panelists and we together see for this perspective.
Well, that's great. Can I just pick up 3 points just to remind us that when we're talking about falling walls, we're also talking about what are the pioneering things we can do at the edge. I think collectively we know sort of the good examples that are around, and perhaps we can use this discussion to shape a bit, perhaps thinking about your labs, what could happen there. Just in terms of mobility, I had a bit of a discussion with Frank about mobility. I think the way you mean mobility is how you connect, interaction, accessibility, access. So it's a much broader sense of mobility, and because you're linking it to human development. I mean, just focusing then on this notion of your potential labs, could we imagine what such a lab might do, given you're a collective intelligence? Who wants to respond what such a lab that Frank's talking about might do, given our conversation here?
Well, of course, I love the lab model. What can I say? I spent 6 years heading one. Perhaps one of the interesting things, and also bringing forward some of Frank's comments as well as Vanessa's, I have the feeling that one of the things we need to move into right now is an every time more nuanced idea of what participatory practices can look like. So in many ways, I think that we need to figure out different schemes, because it's all about how do we bring ideas and how to bring in people and collectives and companies and foundations and academia into creating public value, which is, I think, a really interesting model to get into, because instead of thinking that it's only public institutions that can create public value, now you can actually think of even individuals that are creating public value themselves. So what does a nuanced participatory scaffolding look like? In terms of Mexico City, getting to the Mapaton point, when we needed the data on the ground of how our informal bus system worked, which is the biggest in the world, we basically created a citywide game and had more than 4,000 people participating. And Mexico City now has its first open data simulating GTFS, which is the data for mobility, as most of you probably know. And that was just like sheer citizen power. But that is, and so that is people putting in their energy and their time. But then we also had some other collaborations with universities in Mexico City. Just like one of our universities, UNAM, has 350,000 students. It's the second largest public university in the world. The second largest one has 270,000 students. So one of the reasons why we were able to create like these urban imaginary surveys for the Constitution was because we partnered with these institutions, and we had like a legion of students on the ground asking people in public marketplaces and in all sorts of places, so the digital divide wasn't a thing. But at the same time, while we were doing a Constitution, another part of my team was working with academia in a very different fashion. So let's say, talking about mobility and keeping to that theme, we really think that it's very important that when technology comes in, especially through public institutions, that there's an ethos behind it, because of course there's a thing such as digital gaps. As Vanessa was mentioning, of course, with all of these new technologies, there's all sorts of really interesting falling walls, such as, imagine that surveillance is not only going to be about the external part of our bodies, but now we'll go within into our emotions and into perhaps even our thoughts if evolution continues. But so we actually ended up partnering with, let's say, one of the examples in terms of AI. Mexico City government had never used AI for any purposes within government. And the first time that it was used was through a public contest where we invited people from outside to actually use AI to be able to create more efficient systems for another of our public transportations, which is that serves the periphery of the city. So it moves about 2.5 million people per day, but it's the periphery. So this is many times the people that give us the longest commute or the most painful commute in the world, according to the IBM and TomTom survey, is exactly the people that are traveling great distances. And it was beautiful to see that the first time that AI was used was exactly for the people that usually see the benefits of technology. They're usually not the first wave. Let me put it euphemistically. So sometimes engaging with citizens is about time and ideas, and other times it's deep processes that will take everything from 2 to 3 years to develop things. So that is, I think, one of the futures, I believe, of laboratories, to offer up every time more ways to participate and to create this collective intelligence pool of ideas and talent, and again, to really think about what enabling environments actually look like.
Well, can we come back to enabling environments a bit later? And I'll just write that word down. You can't see me writing, but I'm writing it down. Jutta or Vanessa, any comments on that? And again, in the back of our mind, what would this future be, for example, with a lab? It could be something else as well. But who would like to say something?
I'll go. I don't know.
Yeah,
Jutta, you want to go first? Okay. Thanks for the comment. So, we've been discussing before, also with Frank, these ideas around future cities, right? And there are many around the world, and they involve many different innovations like autonomous cars, AI decision making for critical infrastructure like the energy grid or water treatment, urban agriculture, personalized or quantified health, AI in finance, designing on loans. And I think you can imagine what all these solutions might do, how they might make a city more equal, how they might make a city more sustainable, how they make a city more safe. But a lot of the conversation that I feel is missing is this idea of what kind of city do people want to live in? When you're able to look ahead 10 years to 2030, 25 years in the future, what is a livable city? In what kind of city do people want to live? And I'm part of many projects involving AI and robotics where we are gung-ho on getting that sustainable, smart, safe answer. And we kind of forget on the way there whether we are still part of creating a city that people desire to live in, that is wonderful to live in. And to bring that aspect into the technological innovation research and just the R&D practice, I think is quite challenging.
And have you got any examples, Vanessa, that you think that you've seen which prefigures some of these core things using all that technology you're talking about?
You mean that thinks about this future? Well, I think
has actually implemented something, perhaps.
And that's I don't. Well, I think what Gabriella is trying to do is getting very close, or has tried to do is getting very close. There is a long tail from the science and technological innovations all the way to it landing into a society, being completely implemented, being accepted, the regulations being done, people educated to be able to run that. It's a very long tail, and there are many moments in that timeline where you can lose sight of the eventual model of a city you have in mind. And then just that idea of having a model of a city in mind is not neutral. There are so many stakeholders who have different reasons. A government might have a very different idea of what makes an ideal city than certain groups of the public do. And it would be hard to come to a really shared value system. So for me, I think where I've seen success is where there was a strong integration of science and technology with humanities, kind of social science, research NGOs, companies where they've really tried to work that out together. I think Gabriela's is a prime example of that. And I think the leadership labs that the BMW Foundation is running is also trying to reach that goal.
Mm-hmm. Jutta, any comments from your side? We'll come back to the long tail and the nitty gritty of getting from that vision, or whatever you want to call it, that model, that urban imaginary. Perhaps we're all talking about the same thing and using different words, but we'll come back to that. Jutta, please fire away.
Yes, thank you. So I think I really think it's all about responsible leadership, and so that what the BMW Foundation is focused on is, from my point of view, super important, because if there's no trust in our leadership, citizens won't trust any digital systems and they won't want to participate. So I think trust is the magic sauce that should be there before we create something. And as Vanessa is working with robots, teaching robots how they trust or learn from their environment, feel empathy and things like that, recognize emotions. That's of course super difficult to do that in a technological world, but it's even not easy in our real world. So I think we need to get people educated of all age, because especially our children who are growing up with these technologies, talking to Alexa like there's a girlfriend sitting in the same room. And so I think we need to educate those children on the power they have at their fingertips by using technologies and using that for the good, and also getting our leadership people, and be it in government, be it in science and industry, educated on that there is a way to use technology for the better. And as I did that for more than 10 years now, I can tell you it's not that easy to bring these people into these topics, because they are used to the topics they used to work on for the last 10 years. So if you come up with innovation, it's always like, we tried that 10 years ago and it didn't happen. Today, technology is, of course, on a completely different level. So there are chances and challenges, and I think that was the topic of today. So we can use these technologies, but we need to have a bigger picture. And we should, from my point of view, bring people together and educate, especially citizens, that they can trust these initiatives, like all of us are working on these topics, to create a trustworthy digital future. And I think the participatory way of the lab from Gabriela, of course, that's like a blueprint for all of that.
Yeah, I mean, clearly one of the things underlying what we're talking about is that trust is a currency. But what strikes me about, if we just use Gabriela's examples, she didn't say, oh, let's generate trust, let's do this, let's do that. She focused on solving a problem. And in the process, this is my interpretation, and Gabriela, please correct me, that in the process of doing it, trust developed. It's just like if if you're talking to a wide range of people in the street and say, hey, let's have trust, that's very difficult to grapple with. And so perhaps the BMW and others could think of projects. They may be artistic projects, they may be whatever projects. I mean, I initiated a Biennale of Trust in the Ukraine 2 years ago, where we used artistic experiments to see if people could trust each other. I'm just using that as an example, but we didn't in the projects use the word trust. So Gabriela, can I just ask you that question, whether in a sense the project idea was the most important, the constitution or the map, rather than these very important issues that underline it. I don't know if I've expressed myself clearly enough.
Yes, very clear. I actually think that trust is an incredibly slippery and multifaceted thing, and it never comes from one single point of origin. In hindsight, I think that one of the things that we took for granted after the first year, but that I actually nowadays see as perhaps one of the most important things that the lab was able to do, was to create trust. Because as I mentioned, we were supposed to be a bridge with between government and citizens, where the relationship between government and citizens is so convoluted in Mexico. So just to give you a little taste of this, the last Pew survey of 2018, I believe it was 2017, said that only 8% of Mexican citizens actually trusted democratic practices in Mexico. So there was only one country that scored lower than us. So just imagine that you become a public servant and create a space within this context, and politics is incredibly convoluted and quite brutal in Mexico City. So the very first thing that we needed to do to be able to activate our nature was to become a strange attractor and a possibility space for citizens. And to be honest, I think it had to do with many layers, not only the specific projects, but talking about, I hugely believe in transparency, but I don't think transparency is actually enough. And I think that when you optimize for transparency versus optimizing for trust, you get two very different societies. So transparency can be, by law, you need to show me everything that's in your email or your wallet or your whatever. Trust is a completely different beast, if you will. So everything from the profiles of the people in my team, one of the things, besides half humanities, half urban sciences, the other weird thing about the lab was that only my lawyer and my administrator had prior experience in government. All of my team members mostly came from civil society. So I had everything from activists that before had been fighting with government and suddenly found themselves in the belly of the beast. Because to the conversation that I'm hearing across the table that I absolutely agree with, we really wanted to bring back politics into so-called urban innovation and not thinking that technology, the digital sphere, or innovation are agnostic. We need to think back to first principles. Who do we want to be together? How do we want to live together? How do we want to move together and be healthy together and play together, and et cetera, et cetera. So I have the feeling that it's the people involved of creating, yes, transparent processes, but knowing that that's actually not enough, of being able to engage people on the whole process from beginning to end, because it's very different. And this is why I'm a huge believer in governance structures. When you're only telling people like the data and the numbers of what is happening behind closed doors. And it's another thing where you have a working table of people from all over, like, activists in government that used to hate each other, corporations, et cetera, with the creation of public value as the centerpiece of that table, which is the glue. And that then government becomes more savvy about integrating citizen ideas and academia and companies into their public agenda, but also activists, for example, become a lot more aware of everything that it actually takes to make a city, for example, like such as Mexico City, one of the largest cities in the world, actually function. And the externalities and things that sound really good on paper, but when put in practice, obviously have their complexities. So I think it's a space that matures itself, if you will, and that human touch and that human contact that can definitely be amplified and augmented by digital and technological means, it becomes of utmost importance. So that's actually one of the reasons why I really believe in hybrid models that are both presential, digital, so all sorts of interfaces and interactions that start.
Yeah.
No. Charles, can I be contrary here?
Please do.
So I of course totally agree with Gabriela, but I wanted to set against that. While we all feel that there needs to be this co-design process, we need to come to a shared value framework when people have to have buy-in. I think Ute said this key word, and it's kids, children. And I think that's a huge problem. Every time we come together, we develop a shared value framework, we bring in all the stakeholders, we imagine what the future must look like to save humanity, to make sure the environment is well kept, etc. we are developing a city for people that have not been born yet. So the real stakeholders we can never include, and that's such a conundrum, I find. So we're always basing it on the values of what we have today, that we can democratically get to today. And I feel that's a huge limitation that is just so difficult to overcome.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point. I mean, by the way, Mexico City and Gabriela in the lab had a project with the 5 million children under 14 in Mexico City, which is not the unborn yet. But that's partly why this whole notion of the imaginary is so important. I mean, I know we're imagining for someone else. But can I just come back to words that people have used along this? Building on everything you've said, which is just this sort of timeline, this long tail, because it seems to me that what you're really saying is we need to do a series of things simultaneously. Whether one project has them all embedded, I don't know, but one of them is obviously, you know, about data sovereignty and legal systems and so on. Another is then how that embeds in governance structures. And a third, which I think is quite important, because we've also got Frank here. I've not forgotten you, Frank, don't worry. What we've got is also how you then actually do something practically, because essentially what this session is about is taking the high ground, but also trying to put our feet on the ground. So one of the issues around labs, for example, is you have labs. If you have a helicopter view, you can see so many examples, smaller examples of the type of things we've discussed. And then when you put them together, they're just sort of fragments. And so my question really is, and this is a very difficult one, I know, is what are the key catalysts to somehow bring more of this together? Because in Gabriela's case, the lab was closed when a new mayor came in. Has that been embedded? Have the 350 living labs in the world, are they really embedding things? Do you see what I'm saying? So can I ask you that difficult question about embedding and you know, what's the catalyst or catalysts? Perhaps there are many.
You're raising a question
it.
to me.
To anyone.
Okay.
I'm raising it because I don't know the answer. That's why.
I think at the end, let's start. Happy to join. I think there's no clear answer to that. Perhaps I'd like to slice your question in several bits and relate to the discussion we just had here. I mentioned from the foundation's experience, and now the foundation will have 50 years of networking activities. We see that it's a long-term process, and to build relations, to build this trust, and it's nothing you can get from today off to tomorrow. So first catalyze element for me is really building up existing networks and really bringing them together, and of course enlarging them, inviting others but when you do this, and it's even a process in our work, it should be people that have a similar attitude, a similar mindset to join this process. The second catalyzing element I see is we have two discussions we had. One was the discussion of trust, and one was the discussion of vision. Perhaps I come to the later one. Already, if you're starting about thinking about different cities from whatever, some European one, the big metropoles in Paris, New York, Tokyo, or African cities like Kigali, whatever, you suddenly understand that even from those cities on the current stage, you would have different visions how a good city and a livable city would look like. But now, and that's honestly speaking, coming from my industry experience for more than 20 years, being in product development or having been in product development, if you ask people today what kind of product they would love to have, they could all only answer you in their current context. And now think about the city, and Vanessa mentioned it. If I ask you in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, what kind of city you would like to live in, that will be a tough task. And now having decision with authorities and citizens to talk about this vision needs a process to empower the stakeholders to be able to answer to that. And so a second catalyzing image, and I'm sure that many labs have been working on that, but I still think empowering the stakeholders to have a long-term vision and long-term understanding about the framing and the city they want to live is a crucial element. And then we come to this third discussion we had, the trust. And trust is an interesting element, especially in the context of the digital world, because there is a general reluctance I have seen in several countries towards governments and authorities. But on the other hand, people are giving up their total privacy to digital players. And for me, there's a contradiction in that it shows on the one hand there is an openness from everyone in the world to use digital tools, digital data to really create such processes. But the question is, who are the players in this process which are acceptance from stakeholders? And I think that's a very crucial element in our lab idea we have to work on to bring those players in a situation that they are accepting to work on that and they work together. And there's a fourth element, especially what I heard, and I'm not the expert on this topic yet, but that especially, and I think Gabriela, you mentioned it also, that especially governance, so administration of cities, which are, let's say, the administrator of territories today are lacking the tools and the knowledge to manage the digital infrastructure, digital tools, instrument they would need to govern the city for their citizens. So this fourth element is a very strong one, which probably is currently a moving trend which is coming up and which fits perfectly with our discussion and the framing and the designing of a lab which would be needed. Probably we won't be the only lab, but I think to inspire to have this new framing would be the key element and the key element of success for our process.
Just one thing, I mean, people have said, oh, it's so difficult to say what people imagine a city to be. I'm not sure it is that difficult. I've just thought about, because I'm relatively old, every discussion I've ever had about what people want from their city. And I think there are a series of things that are cross-cultural and possibly true through time. And if, just to say them in one word each, people want a place of anchorage and identity and belonging, you know, the familiar and all of that stuff, the distinctive. They secondly want to be connected far and wide, from the casual encounter to the deep friendship and love, and also the infrastructures that are about connection. Thirdly, they seem to want to be able to fulfill ambitions and opportunities, so they want a place that in one way or another provides that. Fourth, and ever more importantly today, I think people want a place of nurture and nourishment, which is all about the facilities and so on. And fifthly, people want to also move into a higher register, which is perhaps about inspiration, which might have been a church, a mosque, a temple, and or imagination. And so I think those things are true. And I think one of the issues, perhaps not to discuss now, is the language we use when we get sort of into these discussions, and it's very important, perhaps needs to, in a funny way, be more ordinary in order for the audiences that we want to communicate with, so that they viscerally feel the story that we're trying to tell them, not tell them, co-create with them. So I'm just trying to think, because also time is running relatively short, and I feel unfortunately we have to round up. So I've got a suggestion. One suggestion is I'm willing to write all this up, and then you all completely disagree with it. I'm willing to do that, just to see if we've been able to encapsulate some points, so it's not simply a discussion that just quickly took place. And secondly, I wonder whether it's just one lab. Perhaps your labs are precisely some of the things that you can catalyze and force feed some of these experiments that are essentially about the future, that might be driven by the unborn children and so on. Sorry, I seem to be rounding up. No, you all say something to end this. You say, what are the two most important things you're taking out of this conversation? I'm sorry to be such a monopolist. I apologize.
You'll have to say who says something.
Okay, Vanessa, off you go.
Oh, no, I was hoping to be last, but
okay, Gabriella, go first.
So perhaps the two most important things that I take away from this, and I don't take away the conclusion, but actually the open-ended question that has followed me since 8 years ago, is the need for rethinking governance. So I actually would love to think that we're moving towards creative governance. And as I mentioned, like the need for every time more sophisticated and nuanced participatory scaffolding, because I do agree, yes, that, you know, we cannot create these monolithic views of a city or a society, but rather need many embedded, if you will, governance structures that function in different ways and in different forms, depending on the type of public value that needs to be created. So that is one of my takeaways. And then the second bit, I think, is exactly that, you know, what are the visions for the society that we have, but how, instead of them, once again, being monolithic, we actually go for, instead of this one big utopia that, as history has shown, becomes dystopic many times, we go for a notion of heterotopias, or as the Zapatistas would say, a world in which many worlds are possible.
Right, a world with which I like that, Gabriella. Who's next? Jutta, off you go. 2 points.
Thank you. So first of all, thank you all for all these insights. I'm totally amazed what you all achieved so far. And I think there was one thing right in the beginning, what Charles said and Gabriella talked to us about the constitution they created in Mexico City. And I'm from the Cologne area, and there's also a Cologne constitution, which is not seriously a Cologne constitution, but is something that, it's like a layer to everything in Cologne. So they are like 11 paragraphs, but actually there are more, and you can use the D11 you like most in order to, for example, don't take everything always super seriously, and also, like Charles mentioned, it's about the relationship to people, and it's about being kind of normal and not talking in these difficult languages. So being down to earth a bit. And I think maybe we can think about creating a digital constitution. So there are no kind of rules for the digital world, or for the implementation and development of digital tools right now. So there are lots of AI and ethics boards and ethics commissions. Everyone is thinking about all these complicated stuff, how to create explainable AI and all of this. That's super important, but maybe it's possible to create some few points, a digital constitution we all agree on. And of course, it's about using technology or creating technology for humanity. And I think, we should think about things like that. And maybe we can do that also within the labs.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we didn't cover, but I've discussed with you individually, is perhaps there is a different approach from the Chinese approach to all of these things,
Yeah.
these areas, and perhaps the free-for-all American approach, and perhaps
Absolutely.
the best of Europe, not the colonialism bit, but the more Enlightenment values, perhaps is part of this a different way of looking at this. Vanessa, here you are.
There I am. Yeah. So, I mean, you mentioned, Charles, we kind of know what is important to us in the city we want to live. People can articulate what is important to them. And I agree with that. But we might be able to use that to say, well, here I see some problems. We can identify what the problems are to reach that. But then to imagine the solutions is like asking someone if they have a magic stick and they can just say, look, what kind of solution do you want? And that is really tricky. I mean, what is the right solution? So my takeaway from today is that it's really important to have a very, very deep understanding of these problems or these boundaries, challenges that are in the way for us to be able to live in that city, have the most livable city. I think, especially in my field, we think it's solutions, right? We say, all right, I'm going to make this, it'll solve everything. And, you go ahead, you engineer and you make something that is amazing. But it is one solution out of many, and sometimes the problem that it should address is not understood enough. So that's definitely something, this deep analysis of the problem that needs an answer.
No, that's very interesting, because Marco Steinberg, who used to work at the Innovation Agency in Finland, he always talks about, let me make the problem bigger. Because when you come too quickly to a solution, you perhaps actually are getting the wrong solution, and you're not looking at things in a 360-degree way. The other thing that just occurs to me as you're talking is, if we were all a private company and we weren't interested in public value, you'd have an R&D department. So given that we don't know the precisely what's about to happen, we must have R&D versions and formats for R&D and experimentation and so on. So Frank, what do you conclude, please?
Actually, I conclude that's a very important point, that I think the topic is absolute right and needed. So that's for me a kind of confirmation of our approach. And to frame it precisely, I don't believe in a static lab being at one place in the world, rather than perhaps even a network of labs bringing ideas together, because we are talking really about a broad humanity which needs a variety of solutions. And the second one, honestly speaking, is you mentioned a point during the discussion. We are here at Falling Walls conference, and that means our ambition must be to have a breakthrough approach to shape a better future. And for me, that's more a pledge to join on this initiative with different partners in different parts of the world to fulfill this ambition. And hopefully I'll find the right audience at this conference.
Well, I'm very pleased that you've given that pledge about the breakthrough, and I hope collectively we can help contribute to what that breakthrough may or may not look like. So can I thank all of you? Gabriela, thank you. Jutta, thank you. Vanessa, thank you. And Frank, thank you. And I hope to see you in reality soon. So a big virtual hug to all of you. And let's not forget playfulness. Playfulness. My message is playfulness.
Very good.
Okay.